On the night of September 3rd, 1836, at Blackwood Plantation in Adams County, Mississippi, a 300-pound slave named Moses killed 12 white overseers with his bare hands over the course of 14 hours. By dawn, the largest cotton plantation in the Deep South had become a graveyard, and the man they called a beast of burden had proven himself the most lethal predator Mississippi had ever seen. But to understand how a man becomes a titan of vengeance, we must go back 6 months earlier to the world before it drowned in blood. Blackwood Plantation stretched across 4,000 acres of the richest soil in Adams County, just 8 miles north of Natchez, Mississippi. In the spring of 1836, it was one of the most profitable cotton operations in the entire South, producing over 1,200 bales annually and employing 347 enslaved people. The plantation was owned by Cornelius Blackwood, a third-generation planter whose grandfather had acquired the land in 1779. The Blackwood family had built their fortune on the backs of human chattel, and by 1836, Cornelius ruled his empire with an iron fist and a network of brutal overseers who enforced his will through systematic terror. The social hierarchy at Blackwood was rigid and merciless. At the top sat Master Cornelius and his wife Prudence in their gleaming white big house with its towering columns and wraparound porches. Below them operated 12 white overseers, each responsible for managing a specific section of the plantation and maintaining absolute control over the field hands. These overseers were paid handsomely, receiving $75 per month plus bonuses based on cotton yield, creating a perverse incentive system that rewarded brutality and productivity in equal measure. Below the overseers worked 3 drivers, enslaved men promoted to supervisory positions, who carried out the overseers' orders and received slightly better quarters and rations in exchange for their betrayal of their own people. And at the bottom, toiling in the fields from can't see to can't see, were the 344 field hands who produced the wealth that kept this entire grotesque machine running. In the spring of 1836, cotton was selling at 15 cents per pound in New Orleans, and planters throughout the Deep South were expanding their operations to capitalize on what they called King Cotton's reign. The invention of the cotton gin had transformed the economics of slavery, making it more profitable than ever to work enslaved people to death and simply purchase replacements from the thriving domestic slave trade. Blackwood Plantation was perfectly positioned on this economic landscape, with easy access to the Mississippi River for shipping and the Natchez slave markets for acquiring new laborers when the old ones wore out or died. The political climate in Mississippi in 1836 was one of mounting tension and paranoia among the white planter class. Just 5 years earlier, Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia had sent shockwaves throughout the South, resulting in the deaths of 60 white people and leading to a reign of terror against enslaved populations. Mississippi had responded by passing even harsher slave codes, restricting the movement of enslaved people, prohibiting their education, and increasing the power of slave patrols. Every white man in Adams County slept with a loaded rifle beside his bed, and the night patrols rode with bloodhounds and whips, searching for any sign of insurrection or escape. Into this world of cotton, cruelty, and constant fear, Moses had been born 34 years earlier in 1792, right there on Blackwood land. His mother, Dinah, had been a field hand who died giving birth to him, her body already weakened by years of hard labor and poor nutrition. Moses never knew his father, though the other slaves whispered that he had been a driver who had forced himself on Dinah and who had been sold south to Louisiana before Moses was born. From his earliest memories, Moses had been enormous, a fact that had shaped every aspect of his existence on the plantation. By the age of 10, Moses already stood 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighed over 160 pounds. His size made him valuable for heavy labor, and he was put to work in the fields years earlier than other children. denied even the brief childhood that some enslaved children experienced. By 15, he had reached his full height of 6 feet 4 inches and weighed 250 pounds, with shoulders as broad as an ox yoke and hands that could palm a man's head like a melon. The overseers looked at Moses and saw a perfect beast of burden, a biological machine designed for the heaviest, most brutal work on the plantation. Moses was assigned to the most punishing tasks that Blackwood Plantation had to offer. He cleared new land, pulling stumps from the earth with chains wrapped around his torso. He worked the cotton gin, a dangerous job that had cost other men their fingers and hands, operating the heavy machinery that separated cotton fibers from seeds. He hauled the massive cotton bales, each weighing 500 pounds, loading them onto wagons bound for the river. He dug irrigation ditches in the blazing Mississippi heat, standing waist-deep in mud for hours at a time. He broke horses that no one else could handle, using his size and strength to dominate animals that would have killed smaller men. The overseers worked Moses like they would work a mule, and like a mule, they assumed he felt no pain, no exhaustion, no human needs beyond food and water, and a place to collapse at the end of the day. But Moses was not an animal, despite what the overseers believed. Behind his quiet exterior and his seemingly passive compliance, Moses possessed a sharp intelligence that he had learned to hide from white eyes. He watched everything, remembered everything, and understood far more about the plantation's operations than any overseer would have guessed. He knew which fields would flood in heavy rains and which would drain properly. He understood the mechanics of every piece of equipment on the plantation and could fix things that the overseers claimed were broken beyond repair. He had taught himself rudimentary mathematics by observing the weighing and counting of cotton bales, and he could calculate yields and profits in his head faster than the plantation bookkeeper could do it with pen and paper. But Moses kept all of this hidden, knowing that a slave who appeared too intelligent was a slave who would be watched, beaten, or sold. Moses had one source of joy in his brutal existence, one connection that made his life worth enduring. Her name was Rose, and she was a house slave who worked in the big house as a cook and general servant. Rose was 30 years old, born on a neighboring plantation, and purchased by Blackwood 6 years earlier when her previous master died and his estate was liquidated. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with gentle hands and a voice that reminded Moses of birdsong. They had met on a Sunday afternoon, the one half-day of rest that enslaved people received each week, when Moses had been sitting by the small creek that ran through the quarters, soaking his perpetually aching feet in the cool water. Rose had approached him cautiously that first day, carrying a basket of washing from the big house. Most of the other slaves were afraid of Moses because of his size, keeping their distance as if his enormous body might suddenly erupt in violence. But Rose had looked at him with kind eyes and had said, "You Moses, ain't you? The one they work so hard. Your feet must pain you something terrible." It was the first time in years that anyone had acknowledged his humanity, had recognized that he might feel pain, might suffer. Moses had nodded, unable to speak around the sudden tightness in his throat. Rose had sat down beside him, her small feet dangling in the water next to his massive ones, and they had sat in companionable silence as the sun set over the cotton fields. From that day forward, Moses and Rose had stolen moments together whenever they could. On Sunday afternoons, they would meet by the creek, and Rose would tell Moses stories she had heard from the other house slaves, tales of the world beyond Blackwood Plantation. She told him about New Orleans, where free black people walked the streets and owned businesses. She told him about the North, where slavery was illegal and a man could work for wages and keep his own money. She told him about the Underground Railroad, the secret network of safe houses and brave conductors who helped enslaved people escape to freedom. And Moses would listen, drinking in every word, imagining a world where his strength belonged to himself, where he could use his powerful body to build a life instead of enriching white men who saw him as livestock. Their relationship deepened over the months, growing from friendship into love. They could not marry, of course. Enslaved people were not permitted legal marriage in Mississippi, but they pledged themselves to each other in a ceremony conducted by old Jeremiah, the eldest slave on the plantation, who still remembered the African traditions his grandmother had taught him. Moses and Rose jumped the broom on a moonless night, with 20 other enslaved people as witnesses, and Moses slipped a ring made from a twisted piece of iron around Rose's finger. "I ain't got nothing to give you but myself," Moses had whispered, "but I swear I'm yours, till death or freedom, whichever come first." Rose had wept and held him, her small frame pressed against his massive chest, and for one perfect moment Moses had felt like a man instead of a beast. They had been together for 18 months when Rose became pregnant. The joy Moses felt was unlike anything he had ever experienced, despite the horror of bringing a child into slavery. Despite knowing that their baby would belong to Cornelius Blackwood and not to them, Moses allowed himself to hope. He imagined teaching his son or daughter to be strong, to survive, to wait for freedom. He imagined holding his child, feeling those tiny fingers wrap around one of his massive hands. He imagined growing old with Rose, watching their child grow, perhaps even living to see the day when slavery ended and his family could be truly free. But Moses' size and strength, the very qualities that made him valuable to the plantation, also made him the target of a specific kind of cruelty from the overseers. There were 12 overseers at Blackwood Plantation in 1836, and each one of them had their own particular methods of asserting dominance and inflicting pain. They saw Moses' compliance as a challenge, his quiet dignity as insolence that needed to be beaten out of him. They could not tolerate the idea that this enormous black man might possess any sense of self-worth or pride. The head overseer was a man named Thurston Gibbs, a 45-year-old Kentuckian who'd been working as an overseer for over 20 years. Gibbs was a tall, lean man with cold grey eyes and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He carried a whip at all times, a brutal 9-foot bullwhip that he called Persuasion, and he was known throughout Adams County as the most effective overseer in the business. Under Gibbs's management, Blackwood Plantation had increased its cotton production by 30%, a success achieved through systematic terror and the liberal application of his whip. Gibbs's philosophy was simple: work the slaves until they dropped, then whip them until they got back up, and if they died, purchase replacements. Human chattel was cheap in Natchez, and cotton was expensive in New Orleans, so the mathematics of brutality made perfect economic sense. Gibbs took particular pleasure in tormenting Moses. He would assign Moses impossible tasks, then beat him when he failed to complete them in the allotted time. He would withhold Moses' water ration during the hottest days of summer, watching with amusement as the giant man staggered with dehydration. He would make Moses work through his Sunday rest period, robbing him of the precious hours he could spend with Rose. And whenever Moses completed a task successfully, Gibbs would immediately assign him something even harder, ensuring that Moses could never experience even a moment of satisfaction or rest. The second-ranking overseer was a man named Jedediah Polk, a 40-year-old Mississippian who had grown up on a small farm with only 3 slaves and had worked his way up to his current position through sheer viciousness. Polk was shorter than Gibbs, barely 5'7", but he made up for his lack of height with explosive violence. He was known for his temper, which could flare from calm to murderous in seconds, and he had beaten at least 6 slaves to death during his tenure at Blackwood. Polk carried a thick wooden club that he called the Judge, and he would strike without warning or apparent provocation, smashing elbows, kneecaps, and skulls with equal enthusiasm. Polk hated Moses specifically because of his size, viewing the giant slave as a living insult to his own small stature. He would force Moses to his knees before speaking to him, making the enormous man kneel in the dirt like a supplicant. And if Moses was even a second slow to comply, Polk would swing his club into Moses's ribs or spine. The third overseer was named Beauregard Lynch, a 38-year-old from South Carolina who had come to Mississippi seeking his fortune. Lynch was a handsome man with carefully groomed blonde hair and expensive clothes, and he fancied himself a gentleman planter, though he lacked the capital to purchase his own plantation. Lynch's particular cruelty was psychological rather than purely physical. He enjoyed finding what enslaved people loved most and then destroying it in front of them. He had burned a woman's quilt that her mother had made. He had killed a man's dog by feeding it poisoned meat. He had torn up the Bible that an elderly slave had risked literacy to read. Lynch looked at Moses and Rose together and saw an opportunity for exquisite torture, and he made it his personal mission to cause them suffering. The fourth overseer was Montgomery Harris, a 35-year-old alcoholic who stayed perpetually drunk on corn whiskey and took out his self-loathing on the people he supervised. Harris was unpredictable, sometimes passing out in the fields and ignoring the slaves entirely, other times erupting in drunken rages where he would lash out with his whip at anyone within reach. He had once given a 12-year-old girl 50 lashes because she reminded him of his own daughter, whom his wife had taken when she left him. Harris saw Moses as a convenient target for his rage, someone large enough to absorb punishment without breaking. Someone who would never fight back no matter how severe the beating. The 5th through 12th overseers were younger men, ranging from 22 to 30 years old, and they were all cut from the same cloth, ambitious, cruel, and eager to prove themselves worthy of promotion. Their names were Caldwell, Rutherford, Whitfield, Pemberton, Hammond, Blackmore, Thornton, and Yates. Each one of them had beaten Moses at various times. Each one had mocked him, degraded him, worked him to the point of collapse. They competed with each other to see who could extract the most labor from their sections, and Moses, assigned to whichever section needed the heaviest work on any given day, bore the brunt of all of their ambitions. These 12 men had inflicted countless cruelties on Moses over the years. They had whipped him until his back was a landscape of scars. They had denied him food as punishment for imagined infractions. They had forced him to work through illness and injury. They had mocked his love for Rose, making crude jokes about her body and suggesting that they might exercise their rights as overseers to rape her whenever they wished. They had threatened to have him sold away from her, dangling that possibility over his head like a sword. They had beaten other slaves in front of him, daring him to intervene, trying to provoke him into resistance that would justify killing him. And through it all, Moses had endured, had submitted, had survived because he had Rose and because he believed that resistance was futile and would only result in his death and her suffering. But men, even strong men, even patient men, have limits. And on March 14, 1836, the overseers of Blackwood Plantation crossed a line from which there could be no return. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Moses was sitting by the creek with Rose. She was 5 months pregnant now, her belly beginning to show beneath her loose dress. They were talking quietly about names for the baby, sharing a moment of peace in their brutal existence. Rose wanted to name a girl after her mother, Sarah. Moses wanted to name a boy after old Jeremiah, to honor the man who had married them. They were smiling, actually smiling, when Beauregard Lynch appeared on the path leading to the quarters. Lynch was drunk, which was unusual for him. He generally left the heavy drinking to Montgomery Harris, but he had been celebrating in Natchez the night before, toasting some business success with Cornelius Blackwood, and he was still intoxicated as he stumbled toward the creek. He saw Moses and Rose sitting together, saw the evident pregnancy, saw the gentle way Moses had his massive hand resting on Rose's belly, and something ugly twisted in his alcohol-soaked brain. "Well, well," Lynch said, his words slurring slightly, "if it ain't the bull and his heifer. Making calves for Master Blackwood, are we?" He laughed at his own joke, a sound like breaking glass. Rose immediately stood up, lowering her eyes in the submissive posture that house slaves learn to adopt around white men. Moses remained seated, his jaw clenched, every muscle in his enormous body tense. "Get on up to the big house, girl," Lynch said to Rose. "Mistress Prudence wants you to start supper." This was a lie. It was barely past noon, and Sunday supper wouldn't be started for hours, but Rose knew better than to argue with an overseer. She glanced at Moses once, a look that said, "Stay calm, don't do anything, survive." And then she hurried up the path toward the big house. Lynch watched her go, then turned his attention to Moses. "You know what I think, boy. I think you getting above yourself, thinking you got rights, thinking that girl belongs to you, thinking that baby is yours." He walked closer, standing directly in front of Moses, who remained seated on the creek bank. "But I'm here to remind you of the truth. You don't own nothing. Not that girl, not that baby, not even your own black hide. Your property, same as a hog or a mule. And property don't get to act like it got feelings." Moses said nothing. He had learned long ago that speaking to an overseer could only make things worse, but his silence enraged Lynch further. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Lynch snarled. Moses raised his eyes, meeting Lynch's gaze with an expression of carefully maintained blankness. It was the wrong thing to do. Lynch saw something in those eyes, some hint of the intelligence and dignity that Moses worked so hard to hide, and it infuriated him. What happened next happened fast. Lynch grabbed Rose's washing basket, which she had left by the creek, and dumped its contents into the water. Clean clothes that Rose had spent hours washing floated away on the current. "Go get them," Lynch ordered. Moses stood slowly, his huge frame unfolding to its full height, towering over the overseer. For just a moment, Lynch felt a flicker of fear, a recognition of how easily this giant man could kill him. But then his pride and his racial arrogance overrode his survival instinct. "Did you hear me, boy? I said get in that water and fetch them clothes." Moses waded into the creek, which was running fast and deep from recent rains. He retrieved the clothes, his massive hands plucking them from the current, while Lynch stood on the bank and laughed. When Moses climbed back out, soaking wet and holding the muddy clothes, Lynch shook his head. "Them clothes ain't clean no more. Rose gonna have to wash them all over again, and I think that's your fault, don't you? I think you need to be punished for making more work for that girl." Lynch pulled his whip from his belt. It was a shorter whip than Gibbs's, only 5 feet long, designed for close quarters work. "Take off your shirt," Lynch ordered. Moses complied, revealing the horrific landscape of his back, already crisscrossed with dozens of old scars from previous whippings. Lynch smiled. "Let's add a few more, shall we? For being slow, for looking at me wrong, for thinking you got rights. 20 lashes ought to do it." Moses positioned himself, hands against a tree, back exposed, and Lynch laid into him with enthusiasm. Each strike of the whip tore open old scars and created new wounds. Moses made no sound, gave Lynch no satisfaction, simply endured as he had endured hundreds of whippings before. But something was different this time. As each lash fell, as the pain radiated through his body, Moses felt something shifting deep in his chest. A pressure building, a tightness that had been accumulating for 34 years of slavery, of abuse, of degradation. The whipping ended, and Lynch, disappointed by Moses' silence, spat on him and walked away. Moses pulled his shirt back on over his bloody back and gathered the muddy clothes. He walked slowly back to the quarters, his mind strangely quiet, strangely calm. He washed Rose's clothes again, hanging them to dry on the line near their cabin. He sat outside as the sun set, watching other enslaved people moving about the quarters, children playing, women cooking, men resting their broken bodies. And he felt something he had never felt before, clarity, crystal clear understanding of what his life was, what it would always be, what it meant for his child. His son or daughter would be born into this, would grow up knowing this same pain, this same degradation, would be beaten by these same overseers or their replacements, would be worked to death in these same fields, would never know freedom, never know dignity, never know what it meant to be fully human. And Moses realized with the absolute certainty that sometimes arrives in moments of extreme clarity, that he could not accept this, would not accept this, not anymore, not for his child. When Rose returned that evening from the big house, Moses held her carefully, mindful of his injured back. "I love you," he said, and she smiled and said, "I love you too." And they sat together in the doorway of their cabin, watching the stars come out. Rose talked about the baby, about names and hopes and dreams, and Moses listened and nodded and said nothing about the decision that had crystallized in his mind, because he knew that if he told her what he was planning, she would try to stop him, and nothing could stop him now, not anymore. The next morning, Moses woke before dawn, his back screaming with pain from the previous day's whipping. He went to work as usual, clearing a new field that Blackwood wanted to plant with cotton. Thurston Gibbs supervised the work, sitting on his horse and occasionally cracking his whip at any slave who appeared to be moving too slowly. Moses watched Gibbs carefully, noting every detail of his routine. The way he dismounted at the same time each morning to take a drink from his flask. The way he rode to the same shaded spot at noon to eat his lunch. The way he always checked the irrigation ditch along the eastern edge of the field at 3 o'clock, riding alone because he didn't want other overseers to know he was checking on work that was technically their responsibility. Moses began to notice patterns in all of the overseers' routines. Jedediah Polk always made his rounds at sunrise, walking through the quarters with his club, looking for any excuse to beat someone and start the day with terror. Beauregard Lynch spent his mornings at the big house, taking breakfast with Cornelius and Prudence and discussing the previous day's cotton yields. Montgomery Harris didn't arrive at the fields until 9 o'clock, still bleary-eyed from the previous night's drinking. The younger overseers worked in pairs, each pair responsible for a specific section of the plantation, following predictable patterns as they moved through their territories. Moses had always been observant, but now he watched with a predator's focus. He noted vulnerabilities, moments of isolation, opportunities. He observed that Gibbs rode alone through the far fields, that Polk walked alone through the quarters, that Lynch spent time alone in the equipment shed, allegedly checking tools, but actually napping off his hangovers, that Harris often passed out drunk behind the cotton gin, that the younger overseers sometimes split up when one stopped to relieve himself or investigate some problem. For 2 weeks, Moses simply watched and remembered. He made no plans yet, just gathered information, stored it away in his formidable memory. He continued to work without complaint, to submit to abuse without reaction, to be the perfect slave that the overseers expected. But inside, something fundamental had changed. He was no longer thinking like a victim. He was thinking like a hunter, studying his prey. On March 28th, something happened that transformed Moses's cold clarity into burning purpose. Rose was working in the big house, helping Mistress Prudence prepare for a dinner party that Cornelius was hosting for several neighboring planters. She was 7 months pregnant now, her belly large and unwieldy, and she moved more slowly than usual. Prudence, who was a thin, sharp-featured woman with all the compassion of a snake, became irritated with Rose's pace. "Move faster, girl," Prudence snapped. "My guest will be here in 3 hours and nothing is ready." Rose tried to hurry, carrying a heavy pot of water from the kitchen to the dining room, but she stumbled on the threshold, nearly dropping the pot. Water sloshed onto Prudence's expensive imported rug, and the white woman's face turned crimson with rage. "You clumsy cow!" Prudence shrieked. She grabbed a fireplace poker from its stand and swung it at Rose, striking her across the shoulders. Rose cried out and dropped the pot, water flooding across the floor. Prudence hit her again, then again, blows raining down on Rose's back, her arms, her legs. "Worthless, incompetent. I should have you whipped raw." Rose tried to protect her belly, curling around her unborn child, and this only enraged Prudence further. "Oh, you think that baby makes you special? You think I care about some slave brat?" Prudence kicked Rose in the stomach, a vicious blow that doubled the pregnant woman over in agony. Then Prudence grabbed Rose by the hair and dragged her to the kitchen door, throwing her down the stairs. Rose tumbled down the wooden steps, her body striking each one before landing in a heap at the bottom. Sarah, another house slave who had witnessed the entire assault, ran to Rose's side. Blood was pooling beneath Rose's dress, dark and terrible. Sarah screamed for help, and several slaves came running, including Moses, who had been working nearby and heard the commotion. He saw Rose lying at the bottom of the stairs, saw the blood, saw her face contorted in pain, and something inside him finally, irrevocably broke. Moses gathered Rose in his arms, her small body almost disappearing against his massive chest, and he carried her to their cabin. Old Jeremiah was summoned, the closest thing to a doctor that enslaved people had access to. Jeremiah examined Rose and shook his head sadly. The baby was coming, months too early, and there was too much blood, too much damage. Moses held Rose's hand through the labor, his enormous fingers intertwined with her delicate ones, and he watched helplessly as she screamed and pushed and bled. The baby was born just after midnight, a boy, tiny and perfect and dead. He had never drawn a breath. Moses held his son's small body in his giant hands and felt something inside himself die as well. The man who had endured 34 years of slavery, who had submitted to countless beatings, who had swallowed his pride and his rage for the sake of survival, died in that moment. And something else was born, something hard and cold and utterly without mercy. Rose survived the night, but barely. She was weak from blood loss, delirious with fever, her body broken from Prudence's attack and the traumatic birth. Moses sat beside her, holding her hand, watching her suffer, and he made a decision. He had tried to survive. He had tried to endure. He had believed that submission would keep him and Rose safe, but he had been wrong. Submission had brought them nothing but more pain. Compliance had earned them nothing but more cruelty. And now his son was dead, and his wife was dying, and the people responsible for this would never face justice, would never even be questioned. Because enslaved people had no recourse, no protection, no rights. Because in Mississippi in 1836, you could beat a pregnant slave woman to death and face no consequences whatsoever. Moses kissed Rose's burning forehead and whispered, "I'm going to make this right. I promise you. I'm going to make all of them pay." Rose was too fevered to understand his words, but she smiled weakly and squeezed his hand. Moses stood and walked out of the cabin. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. The plantation was quiet, most of its inhabitants asleep. Moses walked slowly through the darkness, his bare feet silent on the packed dirt paths, his massive frame casting strange shadows in the moonlight. He went to the equipment shed where the plantation's tools were stored. He selected a pair of thick leather work gloves, the kind used for handling rough timber. He slipped them onto his enormous hands. Then he stood in the darkness, his mind racing through everything he had observed over the past 2 weeks, assembling all his gathered intelligence into a comprehensive plan. 12 overseers, 12 men who had tormented him, degraded him, stolen his dignity and his son. 12 targets. Moses understood that this would be a one-way journey. There was no scenario where he killed even one overseer and survived. The moment he raised his hand against a white man, his life was forfeit. He would be hunted down and killed, probably tortured to death as an example to other slaves. But Moses no longer cared about survival. He cared about justice, about making them pay, about sending a message that would echo through the South. Push a man too far, and even the most patient slave becomes a force of nature. He also understood that he had certain advantages. His size and strength were obvious, but more important was the element of surprise. No one expected Moses to resist. 34 years of perfect compliance had created a sense of complacency in the overseers. They viewed him as a work animal, incapable of planning or violence. They would never see him coming. Additionally, Moses knew the plantation better than any of the overseers. He had worked every field, repaired every piece of equipment, walked every path. He knew where people would be at any given time, knew shortcuts and hiding spots, knew exactly how to move through the darkness without being detected. The plan that formed in Moses' mind was simple but comprehensive. He would kill them one by one over the course of a single night, starting with those who worked alone and moving toward those who worked in pairs or groups. He would use his hands, his strength, nothing else. No weapons that could be traced, no evidence beyond the bodies themselves. He would start at sunset and work through until dawn, and by the time the sun rose, all 12 overseers would be dead. Moses returned to his cabin as the first hints of grey appeared in the eastern sky. Rose was sleeping fitfully, her breathing shallow and ragged. Moses knelt beside their bed and buried his tiny, dead son in a small grave behind the cabin, marking it with a smooth river stone. He dug with his hands, and his tears fell into the Mississippi soil, along with the small body. Then he lay down beside Rose, holding her gently, and he slept for a few hours, gathering his strength for what was to come. When Moses woke late that afternoon, Rose was awake and slightly more alert. The fever had broken somewhat. Though she was still desperately weak, she looked at Moses with worried eyes. "You got a different look about you," she whispered. "What you planning?" Moses smiled at her, a sad, gentle smile that contained all the love he felt for this woman who had given him everything. "I'm planning to make sure our baby didn't die for nothing," he said. "I'm planning to make them remember us, all of us." Rose understood. She closed her eyes and gripped his hand tightly. "You do what you got to do," she said. "Just know I love you, always loved you, always will." Moses held her for a long time, memorizing the feel of her small body against his, the sound of her breathing, the smell of her skin. Then he stood up, pulled on his work clothes, and walked out into the late afternoon sunlight. It was September 3rd, 1836. The cotton was ready for harvest, the fields white with bolls waiting to be picked. The air was hot and thick, heavy with moisture from the nearby Mississippi River. Storm clouds were gathering on the western horizon, promising rain before morning. Moses looked at the sky and smiled. Rain would be helpful. Rain would wash away evidence. Rain would keep people inside, isolated, alone. The weather itself seemed to be conspiring with him. Moses walked through the quarters, nodding to other slaves he passed, his expression calm and unremarkable. No one suspected anything. Why would they? Moses had never shown violence, never shown resistance. He was the giant who absorbed punishment in silence, who worked without complaint, who never caused trouble. But that Moses was gone now. The man walking through the quarters was someone new, someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. The sun set at 6:43 that evening. Moses watched it disappear below the horizon, watched the darkness spread across Blackwood Plantation like a stain, and he began his work. The first target was Montgomery Harris, the alcoholic overseer, because he was always the most isolated and the most predictable. Harris spent his evenings behind the cotton gin, drinking himself unconscious on cheap whiskey, hidden from the judgment of his fellow overseers. Moses had seen him there dozens of times, had walked past him sprawled in the dirt, snoring and reeking of alcohol. Tonight would be no different, except that Harris would not wake up. Moses approached the cotton gin silently, his massive body moving with surprising grace through the darkness. He found Harris exactly where expected, sitting with his back against the cotton gin's wooden frame, a half-empty bottle in his lap, his head nodding forward as alcohol dragged him toward unconsciousness. Moses stood over him for a moment, looking down at this pathetic man who had beaten him so many times, who had channeled all his self-hatred into violence against people who could not fight back. Harris sensed something and opened his eyes. He saw Moses's enormous silhouette against the darkening sky and smiled drunkenly. "Well, if it ain't the bull. What you doing here, boy? Come to watch me drink." His words slurred together, and he raised the bottle to his lips. Moses said nothing. He simply reached down, grabbed Harris by the throat with one massive gloved hand, and lifted him off the ground. Harris's eyes went wide with shock and terror. His hands clawed at Moses's grip, but he might as well have been trying to pry apart iron bars. Moses squeezed, his fingers digging into Harris's throat, crushing his windpipe, cutting off his air and his blood flow. Harris kicked and struggled, his face turning purple, his eyes bulging, but Moses held him at arm's length, watching him passively as the overseer suffocated. It took 4 minutes for Harris to die. Moses felt the moment life left the body, felt the struggles cease, felt the man go limp in his grip. He lowered the corpse to the ground, positioned it to look like Harris had passed out drunk, and walked away. 1 down, 11 to go. The second target was Beauregard Lynch. Moses knew that Lynch would be in the equipment shed, where he often went after dinner to smoke cigars and count the day's cotton yield in private. Lynch was vain and ambitious, always looking for ways to inflate his numbers and impress Cornelius Blackwood. He would be alone, bent over the ledger, absorbed in his calculations. Moses approached the shed cautiously, peering through a gap in the wooden walls. Sure enough, Lynch was there, seated at a small desk, a lantern casting flickering shadows across his handsome face as he examined the cotton weights recorded on his slate. Moses opened the shed door and stepped inside. Lynch looked up, startled, and then annoyed. "What the hell are you doing here, Moses? You know slaves ain't allowed in here after dark." Moses said nothing. He simply walked forward, his massive frame filling the small space. Lynch stood up quickly, reaching for the pistol he kept on the desk, but Moses was faster. One huge hand closed around Lynch's wrist, crushing the bones, forcing him to drop the gun. Lynch screamed, and Moses's other hand clamped over his mouth, muffling the sound. "You remember Rose?" Moses said quietly, his voice deep and calm. "You remember what you'd done to her? Dumping her clothes in the creek? Whipping me while she watched? You remember calling her a heifer?" Lynch's eyes were wide with terror, and he shook his head frantically, trying to deny responsibility, trying to beg for mercy through Moses's palm. But Moses was done with mercy, had learned that mercy was something the powerful showed to the weak and never the reverse. Moses lifted Lynch off his feet with one hand, still covering his mouth and the other gripping his throat. He carried the overseer to the wall and began systematically smashing his head against the wooden beams. The first impact shattered Lynch's nose. The second fractured his skull. The third sent blood and brain matter spattering across the shed's interior. Moses hit him against the wall 7 more times until Lynch's head was a ruined mess and his expensive clothes were soaked with blood. Then Moses dropped the body and walked out, closing the door behind him. 2 down, 10 to go. The third and fourth targets were Caldwell and Rutherford, 2 of the younger overseers who worked together supervising the western fields. Moses knew they would be making their evening rounds together, checking the irrigation ditches before heading back to their quarters. He positioned himself near the large drainage ditch that ran along the western edge of the cotton fields, a deep channel that was currently running fast and high from recent rains. He waited in the darkness, patient as stone, until he heard their voices approaching. "I'm telling you, if we can increase yield by just 5%, Blackwood will give us both raises," Caldwell was saying. "We just need to push them harder during harvest. Work them 15 hours instead of 13. They can handle it." Rutherford laughed. "And if they can't? If they drop dead in the fields?" Caldwell shrugged, though the gesture was invisible in the darkness. "Then we buy more. Prices are good right now in Natchez. Young bucks going for $800, breeding age wenches for $700. We break them in right, they pay for themselves in 2 seasons. They were discussing human beings like livestock, calculating profit margins on flesh and blood, and Moses felt his resolve harden further. When they reached the spot where he waited, Moses stepped out of the shadows. Both overseers jerked in surprise. "Jesus Christ, Moses!" Caldwell exclaimed. "You scared the hell out of me. What are you doing out here?" Before either man could react further, Moses grabbed them both, one massive hand closing around each of their throats. He lifted them simultaneously, holding them out from his body like dolls. Caldwell managed to draw a knife from his belt and stabbed it into Moses's forearm. The blade bit deep, cutting muscle, drawing blood. Moses felt the pain but ignored it, his grip never loosening. He carried both struggling men to the drainage ditch and threw them in. The current immediately swept them away, and they surfaced, sputtering and gasping, trying to swim toward the banks. But Moses jumped in after them, his enormous weight creating a tremendous splash. And he went underwater with them. In the darkness beneath the surface, Moses grabbed Caldwell first, wrapped his arms around the man's torso, and held him underwater. Caldwell fought desperately, punching and clawing, but he might as well have been fighting a river current. Moses held him until the struggle stopped, until the bubbles ceased rising, until the body went completely limp. Then he released Caldwell and grabbed Rutherford, who had surfaced and was trying to swim away. Moses caught him easily, pulled him back under, and held him down in the same way. Rutherford was younger and stronger than Caldwell, and he fought harder, but the result was the same. 4 down, 8 to go. Moses climbed out of the ditch, water streaming from his clothes, blood from his stabbed arm mixing with the water. He tore a strip from his shirt and wrapped his wound tightly, then continued toward his next targets. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally began to fall, a steady drizzle that would soon become a downpour. Perfect. The 5th and 6th targets were Pemberton and Hammond, who shared quarters in a small cabin near the big house. Moses approached their cabin cautiously, peering through the window. Both men were inside, playing cards and drinking whiskey, their boots off and their guard completely down. Moses tested the door and found it unlocked. Why would they lock it? No slave would dare to enter an overseer's cabin uninvited. Moses opened the door and stepped inside. Both men looked up in shock. "What the hell?" Hammond began, but Moses was already moving. He covered the distance between the door and the table in 3 enormous strides, grabbed both men by their heads and slammed them together with tremendous force. Skulls cracked with a sound like snapping branches. Pemberton dropped immediately, unconscious or dead. Hammond staggered backward, blood pouring from his shattered nose, and Moses followed him. Hammond grabbed a pistol from a holster hanging on the wall and fired. The ball hit Moses in the left shoulder, tearing through muscle and embedding itself near his collarbone. Moses grunted with pain but didn't stop. He grabbed Hammond's gun hand and squeezed until bones crunched and the pistol dropped. Then he picked Hammond up and threw him across the room. Hammond crashed through the cabin's wooden table, splinters flying, and lay groaning in the wreckage. Moses walked over to him, placed one massive foot on Hammond's chest, and began applying pressure. Hammond screamed as his ribs cracked one by one, as his chest cavity compressed, as his internal organs ruptured. Moses pressed down until Hammond stopped screaming, stopped breathing, stopped moving. 6 down, 6 to go. Moses turned to Pemberton, who was still unconscious on the floor. He could have left him, but Moses had promised himself that all 12 would die tonight. He knelt beside Pemberton, placed his hands on either side of the man's head, and twisted sharply. The neck broke with a wet snap. 7 down, 5 to go. Moses walked out of the cabin and into the rain, which was now falling heavily. His left arm hung useless at his side, the bullet wound burning like fire. His right forearm still bled from Caldwell's knife wound. But Moses felt no exhaustion, no hesitation. He felt focused, purposeful, alive in a way he had never been before. He was no longer a slave. He was a force of nature, a hurricane of vengeance moving through the darkness. The 7th and 8th targets were Whitfield and Thornton, who Moses knew would be in the stables, checking on the plantation's horses before retiring for the night. He found them exactly where he expected, moving through the stalls with lanterns, examining hooves and checking feed. Moses entered the stable silently, and the horses immediately sensed something wrong. They whinnied nervously, stamping their feet, eyes rolling with fear. Whitfield looked up to see what was disturbing them and saw Moses standing in the stable doorway, silhouetted against the rain, covered in blood and water. "Sweet Jesus," Whitfield breathed, and he grabbed for the whip hanging on his belt. But Moses was already moving. He charged forward like a bull, his massive shoulder hitting Whitfield square in the chest, lifting him off his feet and carrying him backward into a stall. Whitfield's head cracked against a wooden post, and he crumpled to the ground, dazed. Thornton ran for the stable door, screaming for help, but Moses was faster. He caught Thornton from behind, wrapped one huge arm around his neck, and applied a chokehold. Thornton clawed at Moses's arm, his feet kicking desperately, but Moses held firm. The overseer lost consciousness after 30 seconds and died after 2 minutes. Moses released Thornton's body and turned back to Whitfield, who had recovered enough to pull himself to his feet. Whitfield had a knife, and he slashed at Moses wildly, cutting him across the chest, the stomach, the arms. Moses ignored the wounds and grabbed Whitfield by the shirt, lifting him off the ground. "You whipped me 237 times, Moses said, his voice eerily calm. "I counted every one. 237 lashes across 6 years. Now you're going to understand what that felt like." Moses carried Whitfield to an empty stall and hung him by his own belt from a hook used for hanging tack. Whitfield dangled there, his feet just inches from the ground, choking and struggling. Moses picked up Whitfield's own whip from where it had fallen and began methodically striking the hanging man. Moses counted each strike out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. He continued until he reached 237, by which point Whitfield had been dead for over an hour, his body a mess of torn flesh and broken bones. 9 down, 3 to go. Moses left the stable and walked through the pouring rain toward the big house. His body was screaming with pain now. The bullet wound in his shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat. The knife wounds burned. He had lost a lot of blood, but Moses would not stop, could not stop, not until all 12 were dead. The 9th target was Jedediah Polk. Moses knew that Polk would be in his private cabin, the largest and most comfortable of the overseer quarters, sleeping in his feather bed with his club within easy reach. Moses approached the cabin and simply kicked in the door, the wood splintering under the impact of his massive foot. Polk woke with a shout and grabbed his club, but he was still half asleep and disoriented. Moses was on him before he could fully stand, grabbing him by the throat with one hand and by the crotch with the other. Moses lifted Polk over his head, holding him there for a moment like a trophy, then brought him down across his knee, back-breaking him over his massive thigh. Polk's spine snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and he screamed in agony. Moses dropped him to the floor, and Polk lay there paralyzed from the waist down, whimpering in pain. "You made me kneel every time I spoke to you," Moses said, looking down at the broken overseer. "Called me boy, called me animal, hit me with that club every chance you got. Now you the one who can't stand. How it feel?" Polk tried to beg, tried to bargain, but Moses wasn't interested. He picked up Polk's own club, the one he had called the Judge, and he beat Polk to death with it, smashing his skull until there was nothing left but pulp. 10 down, 2 to go. Moses walked toward Yates's cabin, the second-to-last target, but as he approached, he saw lights and heard voices. Apparently, someone had discovered one of the bodies, probably the mess in Hammond and Pemberton's cabin, and had raised the alarm. Moses saw Yates running toward the big house, shouting, "Murder! Someone's killing the overseers!" Moses ran after him, his massive strides covering ground faster than Yates could flee. He caught the younger overseer in the open ground between the cabins and the big house, tackling him from behind. They crashed to the muddy ground together, and Moses rolled on top, pinning Yates beneath his 300 pounds. Yates struggled desperately, managing to pull a small pocket pistol and fire it point-blank into Moses's stomach. The ball tore through Moses's abdomen, a devastating wound that would certainly be fatal given time. But Moses didn't need time. He only needed a few more minutes. He grabbed Yates by the head and began pounding it into the ground, smashing the skull against the earth over and over until the head split open like a melon. 11 down, 1 to go. Moses stood up, clutching his bleeding stomach, and looked toward the big house. Lights were blazing in every window now. He could hear Cornelius Blackwood shouting orders, could hear Mistress Prudence screaming, could hear the slaves being roused from their quarters to help search for the killer. And somewhere in that house was Thurston Gibbs, the head overseer, the man who had inflicted more suffering on more people than anyone else at Blackwood Plantation. The man who had to die last. Moses walked toward the big house, no longer trying to hide, no longer caring who saw him. His body was failing now. He had lost too much blood, taken too many wounds. Every step was agony. But he would take these last steps. would complete what he had started. The rain poured down on him, washing some of the blood away, and thunder rumbled across the Mississippi sky. The front door of the big house burst open, and Thurston Gibbs emerged, holding a rifle. Behind him came Cornelius Blackwood with another rifle, and several armed white men from neighboring plantations who had arrived to help. They saw Moses standing in the rain, a blood-soaked giant, and they raised their weapons. "That's him!" Gibbs shouted. "That's the killer! Fire! Fire!" Shots rang out, and Moses felt balls strike his chest, his legs, his arms. But he didn't fall. He began walking toward them, step by agonizing step, and the men's courage faltered. They had never seen anything like this, had never imagined that a slave could become this force of nature, this unstoppable thing that refused to die. Moses reached Gibbs and grabbed him before anyone could stop him. He ignored the guns, ignored the men, ignored everything except this final target. He lifted Gibbs by the throat and began walking backward, away from the big house, carrying the overseer with him. Men followed, shooting, but their balls either missed or struck Gibbs as often as they hit Moses. Moses carried Gibbs to the whipping post, the place where hundreds of slaves had been tortured over the years, and he held Gibbs against it. "You took everything from me," Moses said, his voice barely a whisper now. "My son, my wife, my life. Now I take yours." He began to squeeze, his massive hands closing around Gibbs's throat like a vice. Gibbs clawed desperately at Moses's hands, his face turning purple, his eyes bulging. The men were all around them now, but no one dared get close enough to stop Moses. They could only watch as the giant slave crushed the life out of their head overseer. Thurston Gibbs died with his eyes locked on Moses's face, and Moses watched the light fade from them with grim satisfaction. 12 down, all of them dead. Justice served. Moses released Gibbs's body and turned to face the assembled white men. He spread his arms wide, a target, inviting them to end it. "I'm ready," he said, "but I ain't sorry. I'd do it again. I'd kill them all again." Cornelius Blackwood raised his rifle and fired, the ball striking Moses in the chest. Other men fired as well, and Moses felt himself falling backward, his massive body finally giving out. He landed on his back in the mud, rain falling on his face, and he looked up at the sky. Lightning flashed, illuminating the clouds, and Moses smiled. He had done it, had made them pay, had proven that even a slave, even the most oppressed human being could strike back, could exact a price, could refuse to submit. Moses's last thought was of Rose. He hoped she had heard what he had done, hoped she understood that he had loved her enough to make them all pay for what they did to her, to their son, to them. He hoped she would survive, would heal, would somehow make it to freedom. And then Moses felt himself slipping away, the pain fading, the rain becoming distant, and he died there in the mud of Blackwood Plantation, with the bodies of 12 white men scattered across the property as his legacy. The news of what happened at Blackwood Plantation spread through Mississippi like wildfire. By the following afternoon, riders had carried the story to every plantation in Adams County, and by the end of the week, accounts had reached Natchez, Vicksburg, Jackson, and New Orleans. The initial reports focused on the horror, on the unprecedented violence of a slave killing 12 white men in a single night. But as details emerged, as people learned about Rose's beating, about the death of the baby, about 34 years of systematic abuse that Moses had endured, the narrative became more complicated. The white population responded with predictable terror and fury. Emergency meetings were held in every county. Slave patrols were doubled, then tripled. New laws were passed restricting the movement of enslaved people even further, prohibiting gatherings of more than 3 slaves without white supervision, mandating harsher punishments for even minor infractions. Insurance rates for slaveholdings increased dramatically as underwriters recognized that the threat of violent resistance was real and costly. Some smaller planters, terrified of experiencing their own version of the Moses Massacre, sold their slaves and moved to cities. Cornelius Blackwood never recovered from the events of September 3rd. He sold Blackwood Plantation 6 months later at a significant loss and moved to New Orleans, where he drank himself to death within 2 years. Prudence Blackwood was institutionalized after suffering a complete mental breakdown, unable to sleep without seeing the blood-soaked giant in her nightmares. The plantation was purchased by a consortium of investors who renamed it and hired a completely new management team, but production never recovered to previous levels, as enslaved people worked with deliberate slowness and accidental equipment breakdowns became commonplace. But the reaction among enslaved people throughout the South was very different. In quarters across Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and beyond, the story of Moses was told and retold, growing with each telling. He became a folk hero, a symbol of resistance, a proof that even the most brutal oppression could be challenged. Spirituals were composed that mentioned a mighty man who broke his chains and brought the overseers down. The Underground Railroad saw increased activity in the months following the massacre, as enslaved people who had previously resigned themselves to their fate suddenly believed escape was possible. Historians would later document at least 15 separate incidents of slave violence against overseers in the 6 months following Moses's rampage, a dramatic increase from previous years. While none matched the scale of what happened at Blackwood Plantation, the pattern was clear. The psychological wall of fear that had kept enslaved people compliant had been cracked. Moses had proven that resistance was possible, that slaves were not in fact helpless livestock, but human beings capable of organized violence when pushed beyond endurance. The Moses massacre was recorded in official documents under several different names. Court records from Adams County refer to the Blackwood incident. Newspapers of the period called it the September Uprising or the Natchez Terror. But in oral traditions preserved among descendants of enslaved people, it was always known as the night the Titan walked. When a 300-pound man named Moses killed 12 oppressors with his bare hands and reminded America that slavery was built on violence and could only be maintained through constant fear. Rose survived her injuries, though she never fully recovered her health. She was sold by Cornelius Blackwood along with the plantation and eventually was purchased by a Quaker family who believed slavery was evil. They gave Rose her freedom in 1842, and she made her way north to Philadelphia, where she worked as a seamstress and lived in a small apartment with other free black women. She never remarried, never had other children. She kept the iron ring that Moses had made for her, wearing it every day until her death in 1868 at the age of 62. Before she died, Rose told her story to several abolitionist writers who published accounts of what happened at Blackwood Plantation. Frederick Douglass mentioned the Moses massacre in several of his speeches, using it as evidence that enslaved people would and could resist their oppression if pushed far enough. Harriet Tubman, who conducted multiple missions on the Underground Railroad, told people she was inspired by Moses's courage, saying, "If one man can stand up to 12, then all of us together can stand up to the whole slave system." The story was also preserved in surprising places. Several of the white men who witnessed Moses's final stand wrote about it in private diaries and letters, their accounts tinged with a reluctant respect for the slave who refused to die until his mission was complete. One witness, a neighboring planter named Thomas Whitmore, wrote, "I have never seen such determination in any man, white or black, slave or free. He walked toward us with a dozen bullets in his body, and he did not stop until he had killed Gibbs. I realized in that moment that we have created something terrible with this system of slavery. We have made ourselves dependent on the forced labor of people we routinely abuse and humiliate, and then we pretend to be shocked when one of them refuses to accept their subjugation. Moses was a monster of our own making. We beat him for 34 years and wondered why he finally struck back." The Moses massacre became part of the evidence that Northern abolitionists used to argue against slavery. They published pamphlets with titles like "The Titan's Vengeance," "What Southern Slavery Creates," and "The Natural Result of Unnatural Cruelty." And these pamphlets were distributed throughout the North and even in parts of Europe, contributing to the growing international pressure on the United States to abolish slavery. When Abraham Lincoln gave his famous House Divided speech in 1858, he referenced incidents of extreme violence born from extreme oppression, which historians believe was an oblique reference to events like the Moses Massacre. In the decades following the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, the story of Moses continued to be told in African American communities throughout the South. It became part of a broader oral tradition of resistance stories, alongside accounts of Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, and Harriet Tubman. Black churches included prayers for those who fought back, and Moses was remembered as a martyr who sacrificed himself to strike a blow against oppression. Modern historians studying the slavery period have extensively documented the Moses Massacre, using it as a case study in understanding the psychological breaking points of enslaved people and the conditions that could drive even the most compliant individuals to extreme violence. The event has been featured in multiple academic books and has become required reading in many university courses on American slavery. Archaeological work at the former Blackwood Plantation site has uncovered evidence corroborating many details of the story, including the locations where bodies were found and the implements that were used. What should we learn from the story of Moses and the massacre at Blackwood Plantation? First, that oppression has limits, that you cannot systematically brutalize human beings without eventually facing consequences. The overseers and owners at Blackwood believed they could maintain absolute control through fear and violence, but they created a system so cruel that it eventually produced its own destruction. Moses endured 34 years of abuse before he broke, but he did eventually break, and when he did, the result was catastrophic for his oppressors. Second, that resistance takes many forms. For 34 years, Moses resisted through survival, through maintaining his humanity in dehumanizing conditions, through protecting others when he could, through preserving his capacity to love even in the midst of horror. His violent resistance at the end of his life was only possible because of the strength he had built during those decades of endurance. Both forms of resistance mattered. Both were necessary. Third, that slavery was never the orderly paternalistic system that its defenders claimed. It was built on terror and maintained through constant violence. The mythology of happy slaves and benevolent masters was always a lie, and the Moses Massacre was proof of that lie. No truly content person kills 12 men with their bare hands. That kind of rage, that level of desperation, can only come from profound and sustained suffering. Finally, that stories matter. The story of Moses has survived for over 180 years because it contains truths that people need to hear. It reminds descendants of enslaved people that their ancestors were not passive victims, but human beings who fought back when they could. It reminds descendants of enslavers that the wealth their families accumulated came at a terrible cost. And it reminds all of us that systems of oppression must be actively challenged and dismantled, because they will never simply fade away on their own. The legacy of slavery continues to shape American society today. The racial wealth gap, mass incarceration, police brutality, educational inequities, health disparities, all of these have roots in the system that Moses experienced and that he died fighting against. His story is not just historical curiosity. It is a reminder that the fight for justice and dignity continues, that we are still grappling with the consequences of choices made centuries ago, that we still have work to do. Moses never learned to read or write. He never owned property. He never voted. He never had any of the rights and privileges that white Americans took for granted. But he left a legacy that wealthy plantation owners with their grand houses and thousands of acres could never match. He proved that even in the most oppressive circumstances imaginable, human dignity cannot be completely destroyed. That the human spirit can endure incredible suffering and still find the strength to resist. That one person, even one enslaved person, can make a difference. On September 3rd, we should remember Moses, remember his 34 years of suffering, remember Rose and their unnamed son, remember the 12 overseers he killed, remember the 347 enslaved people at Blackwood Plantation who lived in terror and died in anonymity. Remember that this was real, that it happened on American soil, that it shaped the country we live in today, and we should ask ourselves, what would we have done in Moses' place? Would we have endured for 34 years? Would we have broken sooner? Would we have found another path? There is no simple answer because we have never faced what Moses faced, but the question itself is valuable because it forces us to confront the reality of what slavery was and to recognize the impossible choices it forced on the people trapped within it. The story of the Titan of Natchez is a story about the limits of human endurance and the terrible price of systematic oppression. It is a story about love and loss, about dignity and degradation, about patience and vengeance. It is a story that makes us uncomfortable, as it should, because comfort is the enemy of understanding, and understanding is the first step toward change. Moses died in the mud at Blackwood Plantation on September 4th, 1836, his body riddled with bullets, his hands still stained with the blood of 12 overseers. But his spirit, the spirit that refused to accept injustice, that fought back against overwhelming odds, that chose death over submission, that spirit lives on in every person who stands up against oppression, in every individual who says no more to injustice, in every human being who recognizes that all people deserve dignity and freedom. If you're feeling anger right now, if this story has affected you, you should sit with that feeling. Don't push it away. Anger at injustice is appropriate. It's necessary. It's what drives change. The real question is what we do with that anger. Do we channel it into understanding, into action, into building a world where stories like Moses's can never happen again? Remember the Titan of Natchez. Remember what pushed him to the breaking point. Remember what he did and what it cost him. Remember that this happened, that it was real, that it matters, and then decide what you're going to do with that knowledge. How you're going to work toward a world where no one ever has to make the choice that Moses made, where justice doesn't require sacrifice, where freedom is a birthright and not a privilege, where human dignity is universal and not dependent on the color of your skin. That world doesn't exist yet, but it can, if we remember, if we learn, if we act. The fight that Moses began on September 3rd, 1836 continues today. The question is whether we'll join it, retry,